Yes.
Good evening. My name is Whitney Moyer, and I am a student supervisor at the Clark Forum for Contemporary Issues. On behalf of the Clark Forum, I would like to welcome you to tonight's event, Violence in Gaza, a panel discussion. The Gaza Strip is one of the most densely populated places on Earth, with 1.5 million people living on a land half the size of the Hawaiian island of Maui and only 2 times the size of Washington, D.C. Gaza Strip's population grew abruptly in 1948 to 1949 when thousands of Palestinian refugees fled to escape fighting between Arab and Jewish forces. Many of today's Gazans are descendants of those refugees. 1 million of them are UN-registered refugees, and almost half of the population are children aged 14 and younger. Recently, in response to Hamas's rocket attacks, Israel initiated a bombing campaign, followed by an invasion. After more than 20 days of conflict, Israel announced a unilateral ceasefire with Hamas and completed its withdrawal from the Gaza Strip on January 21, 2009. It is estimated that 13 Israelis were killed, 3 of whom were civilians, while it is estimated that 1,330 Palestinians, including 904 civilians, were killed. The panelists for tonight's discussion are Professor David Commins, Professor Ed Webb, Professor Itzchak Weismann, and Professor Sherifa Zuhur. Acting as moderator is Ed Webb, Assistant Professor of Political Science and International Studies. Professor Webb's teaching and research focuses on Middle East politics, comparative politics, and international relations. Professor Webb received his bachelor's degree from Cambridge University and his master's as well as his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. Additionally, Professor Webb lived and worked in the Middle East and Europe as a diplomat. David Commins, the Benjamin Rush Chair in the Liberal Arts and Sciences, is a professor of history who earned his bachelor's at the University of California, Berkeley, and his PhD from the University of Michigan. Over the years, he has received Fulbright grants to fund Arabic studies at Damascus University, to research Islamic modernism in Ottoman Syria, and to study Wahhabism in Saudi Arabia. Itzchak Weismann is a visiting assistant professor of history. He obtained his bachelor's degree, master's, and PhD from the University of Haifa, as well as postdoctorate at Oxford and Princeton. Much of his research centers on Sufism. Finally, Sherifa Zuhur is professor of Islamic and regional studies at the U.S. Army War College. Dr. Zuhur's research centers on Islamic movements, political, war, and peace in the Middle East, and Islamic political and religious philosophy. She has studied Islamist movements and interviewed their membership and leaders since 1980 when she was a graduate student in Egypt. Dr. Zuhur earned her bachelor's degree, master's, and PhD from UCLA. At this time, I would like to ask that the sound be turned off on all cell phones and other electronic devices. In addition, please hold any questions that you may have until the end of the presentation, when there will be a short question and answer session. Out of courtesy to those who may be hearing impaired, and because we are taping this event, please raise your hand and wait for a microphone to be passed to you before speaking. Thank you for your cooperation, and now, please join me in welcoming our moderator and all of our panelists.
Good evening. Can you hear me at the back? Good, thank you very much. It's great to see such a wonderful turnout for this event. Of course, it's an event that's garnered a lot of attention in the media. It is extraordinarily controversial. The way we talk about this, of course, arouses passions in every direction. As a student and a present teacher of media and some issues around media, how media frames conflicts and political issues in the Middle East, it's been particularly fascinating for me to watch. For example, the Israeli Consul General in New York using Twitter, a microblogging service, to hold a news conference, to see all the debate about how and whether journalists should have access to this or that part of the conflict. It is quite clear that how we frame this discussion and the kind of language we use about it is extraordinarily important. I know that, for example, the way this event was publicized caused some angst on campus. I think that's pretty much inevitable. Whichever questions we choose to ask, we leave others unasked. Someone will be frustrated. What I want to appeal to you all, everyone in this room tonight, is to remember that this is not a debate. This is not a trial. We're not trying to assign blame. We're not trying to find out who is wrong or who is more wrong. What we're trying to do is have a civil and analytic discussion of what it is we can know about what has happened, what it means for those in the region, what it means for outside actors, particularly but not only the United States government. And I would ask you, particularly when it comes to time for questions and answers, I hope we will have more than a short question and answer session. I hope we'll have a long question and answer session, within reason. But when it comes to that time, I hope that we will have questions, not position statements, that we will have discussion and not polemics. Many people in the room will have very strong feelings about this, but we should be able to have a civilized discussion, and I hope we will. I know you will hear some very civilized discussion from our excellent panelists this evening. So, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Itzchak Weismann and leave it to him to get things rolling.
Good evening. I think, like others on the panel, I wear two hats here. One is a scholar who studies the Islamic movements, and one is an Israeli, not a representative of the Israeli government or army or anything else, but somebody who lives in Israel and have a first-hand knowledge about the mood in the street, about Israeli society. And therefore, my talk will be about these two aspects. I'd like to talk about the nature of the threats that Hamas poses to Israel, and about the mood of the Israeli street, a little bit about government before the Operation Gaza, under Olmert's government, and during this action. Well, I see Hamas as part of the radical wave that swept the Arab and the Muslim world since the 1970s. Although, of course, it also has its own features that are unique to the Palestinian arena. The basic principle of this radical wing is that not only the West, but also Muslim governments and societies have become non-Islamic, and therefore the radicals call for an uncompromising war against the West, against Muslim rulers, and to rebel against, to raise societies against the governments. This is a departure from older forms of Islamic fundamentalism, which basically called to work with the people, with the Muslim masses, in order to correct the government, make them more Islamic, but not to rebel against them and not to use means of violence. The radicals succeeded in Iran, as everybody knows. Something is connected to the Shia identity of the Islam in Iran. In the Sunni world, the radicals generally failed. They rebelled many places. The assassination of Sadat, the rebellion, the revolt in Hamat in Syria, and other places, but generally governments were stronger. What happened is that the radicals did succeed and did move to places where governments were very weak or where there was a political vacuum which they were able to fulfill. These are places like Afghanistan, like Lebanon, in the wake of the civil war, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Algeria, when they almost got to power and where the government didn't allow them to go on, the result was a terrible and bloody civil war which lasted for years. Hamas, well, also thrives because of such a political vacuum that began already the last years of Israeli rule over Gaza and still and the West Bank, and especially after the Israeli pullout, when they fought the Palestinian government or authority, and of course also Israel. And this is the dynamic of their strengths. Hamas sprang out from the Muslim Brothers, from the more moderate wing of Islamic fundamentalism, but as it radicalized in the first Intifada, it was able to gear all the huge networks, charity networks and welfare networks that they had in Gaza and in the West Bank toward the radical goal, which is an uncompromising jihad against Israel with the explicit goal of exterminating the state of Israel. No room for compromise, no room for negotiation, as the goal is very clear. Hamas also used all means of violence without any restrictions, and it doesn't make any distinction between military and civilians. From the day Israel pulled out from Gaza, they started to shoot rockets towards Israel. It is directed at cities, villages, yes, explicitly against civilians. The restriction on Hamas was actually their ability to what they can accomplish. Whatever the Israeli government, whatever scope it left for action, this was swiftly filled by Hamas. If it was suicide bombings in the beginning of the decade, after the wall or the fence was built, so it was sharing beyond the borders, yes, and whatever Israeli government allowed, so there Hamas was to operate. Well, as I see it, the questions that we posed is Israeli action disproportionate? Well, the threat of Hamas was ever extending, yes, ever greater. More and more Israeli cities and places came under Hamas fire. So it was just a question of time when Israel decided to go into it. Is this proportional? As the question posed before this panel. Well, I think the threat is in many ways existential, and the result is accordingly. Well, I would say yes, we can debate. Maybe it was disproportional, but because it was too strong, or maybe it was too soft. That's a question that we can raise and discuss here. The same about the timing. Why did it happen now and not another time? So the conspirational theorists talk about the Israeli elections, the coming, and the Labour Party that apparently is losing, and then that's a way to bolster the chances for elections. I don't think so. I don't think this is, the action was too early, or the timing was decided by the elections. On the contrary, I think it was delayed more and more. And this is because of the great anxiety in the Israeli society about what's happening not only in Gaza, but along its borders, and even within Israel. And this is the second point. I still have time. 2 minutes. Well, 2 minutes for the Israeli mood. This is 2 hours. Okay. Well, I think, and my feeling is, one who lived Israel until the last half year when I came here, there's a lot of anxieties in Israel, especially since the Lebanon war. There is a feeling that there is a change of our enemies now come up, very sophisticated organizations, very dedicated, deadly enemies. They are sophisticated in weapons, but not less so with the media. And, well, in the Lebanon war against Hezbollah, the first war of this kind, Israel, in many ways, lost. And there was much anxiety that Hamas is the same. When the second Intifada came, and later, there was also fear about the Palestinian population inside Israel, what they are going to do. So the north was bombed 2 years ago. There was much fear that the same is going to happen in the south, and therefore this operation was deferred more and more and more, albeit the increasing shooting from the Hamas side. The timing, I think, is much connected to the U.S. politics more than to Middle East or any Machiavellian considerations. It's my assessment. I don't know it. I didn't hear it for the government. But I think it was an operation that they decided to do it before President Obama comes into office, in the hopes that it will be less pressure for Israel to stop the operation, and under the Bush administration, then it will be in the new president. So I think this is about the timing. It's not about substance, to do it or not to do it, but only when to do it. So I think this is what I can say in 10 minutes.
10 minutes is a frighteningly short time. We'll move it right along. Thank you, Itzchak. Let's get going.
Okay. I don't know where to start. I have to say that I disagree with my esteemed colleague about the background of Hamas. And I don't have very much time to go into the mischaracterization of radical Islam, which should be better called the Islamic awakening, because it really encompasses a whole variety of movements, not only those which wish to change their political systems. It's also individuals who simply wish to be more religious, and also individuals who aim for an Islamic state. The position of the Muslim Brotherhood, which I began my graduate work on, and I know members of Hamas since the 1970s, as some of them were members of the Muslim Brotherhood, was different. They went through a radical period in the 1940s, and they had to make a deal. They were imprisoned, exiled, could not withstand the power of the Egyptian state, and they made a deal, really, to not engage in formal politics as a party beginning in 1971. Hamas, coming out of this movement in Gaza, was in a very weak position. In other words, the parties with enthusiasm were the leftist, were the more secular, not entirely secular, because Fatah itself, all of its members, founding members, but Yasser Arafat, were also in the Muslim Brotherhood. So it also has a streak of Islamism in it. Those were the current and the struggle, and the groups that were supposed to deliver the Palestinians from occupation, and they failed to do so. The PLO changed its way forward in the late 70s, and then in the 1980s, forwarded a two-state solution. In Gaza, the concern of those who became part of Hamas is kind of complicated. They did not want all this youth to expend their energies in the radical movement and without an end. So what they did switch from is the aim of an Islamic state first to the aim of resistance. And rather than choosing that shift, I believe they were sort of pulled into it by the eruption of the first Intifada. And they date their own inception from the first Intifada. They gave themselves that birthday. So resistance was their new mantra. And in terms of Israel's Arab policies, this was really a complete failure. You have successive wars and all kinds of policies in which people are given a certain amount of representation, but they're not allowed to control their own political rights. They have no freedom of movement. They have no control over their religious organizations, and so on. So you have really a strange dynamic in which Palestinian society gravitated more and more and more to an alternative that might bring what the PLO could not. In other words, an end to occupation. In other words, Hamas is and became, as it states itself, a political organization. It is not an organization whose radical Islamic aims are first. They're very important, but they won't force them on the Palestinian people. That's their position. Now, I want to talk about the current conflict, and I want to introduce a few other questions. I think the issue of was the action disproportionate? Of course it was. We're talking about the death of a small number of individuals, and every death is important, don't get me wrong, and the death of more than 1,300 individuals and more than 5,300 killed, and we're talking about absolutely civilian organizations, including a UN school, including all kinds of infrastructure that had nothing to do with Hamas being destroyed. What is the impact? What is the psychological impact on the Gazan Palestinian population? And the real question then becomes why. We have assertions of leadership on the Israeli side and on the Hamas side. I think we have to be very dubious about what people say at the end of any conflict. Each side claims to have won. But for ordinary Palestinians, why this onslaught and why this degree of onslaught if there is not some substantial political change that is to be forced? And here I agree with my esteemed colleague that American politics have everything to do with it, because last Friday a memorandum of understanding was signed between the Israelis and the Americans, which will be very difficult for Barack Obama to break without all kinds of accusations about the long-standing relationship between the United States and Israel. Moving back to Hamas a little bit, I want to ask a few other questions, or you can ask them, we can talk about them later, which is really what happens now. Hamas is a complicated organization, and it has a number of conflicts that come out of this situation. And again, there were points that I want to disagree with, but I don't want to get dragged down into this because we're not going to agree. I also have lived in Israel, and I used to travel with my landlord, who is a Russian-speaking Arab Israeli, who treats poor people all through the south of Israel. He goes out to horse farms, he goes everywhere, and every week we used to go to Sderot and Mabuim, and these towns that received the rocket fire, which was considered in the time period that I lived there nothing but a nuisance, because these are what you call dumb rockets. You cannot exert an aim. They're not the same as aerial bombardment with infrared. They're not. It's not the same animal. And you can ask the question, okay, if you want to appear to have the moral high ground, in an onslaught like this, why do you fire off so many rockets in these 3 weeks of what the Israelis called Operation Cast Lead? And my answer is because there's nothing else they could do. There's nothing else they could do. And to lead the resistance, you must do something. As far as who was shooting off the rockets before, let's not forget that there was a truce from June until November 5th of this year. Quite a successful truce, and many people, including myself, thought that the best thing to do would be to conclude another truce, and if possible, involve the international community and the Arab community and the Palestinians within a more unified framework to seek a continuing truce. Hamas's position is not against a truce. Hamas has had held a truce for 4 years. Hamas has not been the primary firer of rockets at Israel. For that, you get to look to other groups like Palestinian Islamic Jihad and some of the minor actors. So its position is implicitly to say, yes, the moderates in the party up to now had carried it that a two-state solution was accepted. We're not talking about peace, we're talking about a long-term truce, and that if the Palestinian population wanted to hold a referendum and talk about long-term peace, Hamas would adhere to that because its mission is to represent the Palestinians and end occupation. Not more than that. Actually, I'll stop there. Give my time.
This is astounding. With very well-behaved panelists, you'll notice. I hope when it comes to Q&A.
Oh, and I have these to give out. I didn't bring enough. But sorry, this is a new monograph on Hamas. So in case you want to hear my version of the background, you can read it.
Okay, thank you. We'll move straight along to Professor David Commins.
I have a little script because if I don't, I won't say what I want to say in just 10 minutes. My remarks address the ramifications for the United States and the region primarily. But before I get to the United States, I want to set the stage by describing how complicated the situation is that confronts the United States. Because what has just transpired in Gaza is part of a set of intertwined political struggles. One set of political struggles is ongoing within national political arenas. Among Palestinians, there is a political struggle between Hamas and Fatah for leadership among Palestinians. And this is not a new battle, it's an ongoing battle. Hamas won Palestinian elections 3 years ago, and instead of reaping a measure of international legitimacy for participating in democratic elections, Hamas found itself subject to boycott by the U.S. and the European Union, in addition to blockade on the borders of Gaza by Israel and Egypt. And Fatah found itself really in a de facto alliance with Israel and the United States. So this is one dimension that what happened in Gaza is not just between Israel and Hamas, is part of an intra-Palestinian struggle. Of course, Israeli politics is also involved. I don't follow Israeli politics nearly close enough to comment on whether or not the timing was linked to the forthcoming elections or not, as Itzchak believes, but I think the recent conflict will play a role in the outcome of the election on February 10th. There's also a dimension in the other country that neighbors Gaza, Egypt, all right, because Hamas is a cousin or offshoot of the Muslim Brothers, who are the main opposition group in Egypt. And if the Egyptian government has sometimes what from an American perspective look like puzzling stands on Gaza, it's because Gaza is not for Egypt primarily a Palestinian issue, it's an Egyptian domestic political issue. As Hamas's fortunes rise, in all likelihood, the popularity of the Muslim Brothers rise in Egypt, much to the consternation of the Egyptian government. So there's a domestic Egyptian facet at play as well. Of course, there is the Israel versus Palestine dimension, and then there's also the dimension of rival political alignments in the Middle East. You have on one side roughly Iran, Syria, Hamas, and Hezbollah versus Egypt, Saudi Arabia, maybe Jordan, but certainly Fatah and the Palestinian Authority. So you have intertwined levels of political struggle going on in different arenas. And the United States is not a disinterested spectator. It is aligned with Israel, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Palestine Authority under Mahmoud Abbas and Jordan. The United States wishes to weaken Iran, Syria, Hamas, and Hezbollah. This is elementary American foreign policy at the moment, even with the transition from Bush to Obama. I don't think that's changed. The U.S. also wishes to prevent al-Qaeda from gaining influence in that part of the Middle East. Right now, al-Qaeda's influence in the Egyptian, Israeli, Palestinian, Lebanese arena is rather weak. Okay? And the United States wants to keep it weak. Now, here's the part that might sound really strange. Hamas is the major obstacle to al-Qaeda's influence among Palestinians. All right? Contrary to the really simplistic is a kind word for it, image of a war on terror that we've inherited from the Bush administration, there is a fierce political battle among groups that the Bush administration would throw into the same basket. And there's a ferocious propaganda campaign between Ayman al-Zawahiri on the one hand, Hamas and the Muslim Brothers on the other. Zawahiri of al-Qaeda condemned Hamas for participating in elections and condemns Hamas for selling out Islam to pursue particularist nationalist politics and for really betraying the Hamas mission of loyalty to Islam. And of course, Hamas gives as good as it gets. So there is this very ferocious ideological rivalry. And I think it's fair to say that one of the, in fact, I saw this reference in some of the Israeli coverage of operations in Gaza. One of the considerations that gave Israelis pause to even consider the notion of toppling Hamas is what comes after. All right? And one Israeli observer said the only thing worse than Gaza in Gaza would be Somalia in Gaza. All right? A truly stateless situation that would give al-Qaeda an opportunity to establish itself more firmly. And Hamas, of course, doesn't want to give up power. Hamas is hanging on, and Hamas doesn't want to cede power to either Fatah, the Palestine Authority, or to al-Qaeda. Now, as for the United States, none of this is neutral for the United States standing in the region. The specter of Israeli bombardments and hundreds of dead civilians damages the standing of the United States in the U.S. and the Muslim world and lends credence to al-Qaeda's and other Islamist conception of a crusader Zionist assault on Muslims, in which the United States is the leader. The U.S. is blamed for civilian deaths, and that undermines governments friendly to the United States. The U.S. is blamed for boycotting Hamas after President Bush proclaimed a democracy agenda for the Middle East and then rejected the outcome of a fair election. The United States is blamed for the embargo on Gaza and civilians suffering from shortages of food, fuel, and medicine for the last 3 years. And the U.S. is blamed for plotting with the Palestine Authority to overthrow an elected Hamas government, for undermining democracy for Palestinians in favor of bolstering an unpopular, corrupt, but pliable regime under Mahmoud Abbas. So none of this is neutral for American interests in the region. Now, the transition from Bush to Obama presents the U.S. with an opportunity to revive vigorous and broad diplomacy to alter the region's political dynamics. And it seems as though President Obama is keen to pursue a new diplomatic approach. I would say that the approach he's likely to pursue is multilateral, reviving a multilateral approach that the first Bush administration pursued, starting with the Madrid Conference in 1991, and the Clinton administration pursued as well for 8 years, and then was abandoned by the recent George W. Bush. Now, multilateral diplomacy means dealing with this very dense web of political struggles at different levels in different arenas. And I think that the U.S. would do well to pursue 3 goals roughly simultaneously: a resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, a peace treaty between Israel and Syria, and a peace treaty between Israel and Lebanon, with all the issues that all of these entail. This is easy to say, obviously very, very difficult to achieve. But without sustained, creative American diplomatic effort, the cycle of violence is certain to continue, with the likely effect of sapping political strength from U.S. allies and nurturing the foes of the U.S. A Palestinian-Israeli treaty would lower the region's political temperature. Many people have argued that the U.S. support for Israel is not the main cause of Islamist animosity towards the U.S. That's bunk. And anybody who's ever lived in the Arab world for a month knows that that's bunk. The image on television screens of Palestinian civilians and properties being damaged fuels everyday anger. There's no question about it. You take those images off the screen, sure, there's going to be lingering anger and bitterness, but it's not refreshed every time there's a new confrontation. Peace treaties between Israel and Syria and Lebanon would weaken the politics of resistance. After all, one of the words in the phrase from which Hamas takes its Arabic name, maqawama, is resistance. And this politics of resistance is like oxygen for Hamas and Hezbollah. If there is a peace treaty between Israel, Lebanon, and Syria, Iran's influence would weaken. It wouldn't vanish, but it would weaken. Israel's northern front would be secure. It is, of course, impossible to know or predict whether a recommitment of U.S. diplomatic energy to the region will attain results that benefit the living conditions of everybody in the region, will improve the security of everybody in the region. But it does seem as though the United States abstention destines the region to a cycle of intermittent violence. Zbigniew Brzezinski recently said that without the U.S., the parties cannot resolve the conflicts on their own. Now, what Obama's going to face and Secretary Clinton is going to face are Hamas, Hezbollah, Israel, Jordan, Egypt, Syria, the Iranians, maneuvering for maximum advantage. The political stage is never stable or constant, and the diplomatic challenges are daunting, perhaps insurmountable. The record of violence and diplomacy in the region since 1948 indicates the only way out is through external mediation. Good luck, President Obama and Secretary Clinton.
I would like to thank our panelists for amazingly exactly keeping to time. That never happens. Just did. So there's hope for all kinds of things if we can do that. Now, just before we move to questions, I just wanted to put something up here on the screen. In the introductory remarks, there was a mention of how densely packed this area is. Here is a map of Gaza and southern part of Israel superimposed on the Washington, D.C. area, just to give you a sense of the scale we're dealing with here. So as you can see, if it were in the same neighborhood, Jerusalem will be just somewhere south of Baltimore, right? So we're not talking, the whole of this, all this conflict is packed into a very, very small patch of dirt indeed. Okay. I'll leave that up there for a bit. You can try to take it in. It's difficult. Before we move to general questions, I would like to invite Caroline Fortin from Hillel to ask a first question to the panel, and then Anum Khan from the Muslim Students Association will also ask a question. Please, both now and when we have the general questions and answers, raise your hand and then wait, please, for the microphone. We are recording, and not everyone will hear you at the back if you do not wait for the microphone. So, Caroline, if you could raise your hand, there's a microphone coming to you now.
Okay. Our question is, do you believe a continued ceasefire... Is it not on? Can you hear me? Okay. Do you believe a continued ceasefire or treaty is possible, given that Israel is approaching a transition period within its government, and that Hamas is not a recognized government by many world powers, most notably the U.S.?
Who would like a crack at that?
It's possible. I think, if I'm not mistaken, we have 2 unilateral ceasefires, which means it's not negotiated. And I understand that the ceasefire negotiated last June was not between Israel and Hamas, but each one made agreements with Egypt, and Egypt conveyed these pledges to each other. Now, frankly, whatever ceasefire exists right now, I think is unstable and unlikely to hold. That's how I see it.
Well, I would say it is impossible to have a continuous ceasefire. I think as long as weapons enter into the Gaza Strip, it will not be possible to have a long-term ceasefire. So maybe here is another role for the United States or the international community to make a kind of force, international force that will keep this border between Gaza and Egypt. Otherwise, it's just a question of time when it will be another eruption.
I believe there could be a continuous ceasefire. However, I don't think you get a very accurate picture of what Gaza is like from the map or from us talking. Gaza is a prison. Okay? The waterway, the beach, that's not open. Nobody can take a boat out there. If you take a boat out there, you're fired on. You can't go the other way. Okay? When there was trade in between, you go to a truck stop and you see tomatoes rotting. Okay? Trucks with tomatoes rotting. There's no passage. There's been no passage of oil, drinking water, food, medicine, cash, steel, anything. So one, absolute necessity of the ceasefire is the boycott has to end for the Palestinians, not for Hamas, for them to survive.
Thank you. Anum?
How do you feel about the role the media plays in the portrayal of the Gaza conflict? It's for anyone on the panel.
How do we feel about it? Or what do we think about it?
What do you think about it?
I don't have any strong feelings because I didn't watch mainstream American media. I was reading the blogs that I read that I depend on to reinforce my view of the world, which is what everybody does with blogs.
Well, I think it is you who is the media specialist, but for me it's almost Kafkaesque, the difference between the media in certain countries and our media. So I actually called CNN 3 times to complain about certain things that were said. I was very upset by the use of the phrase human shield. Human shield means a specific thing in military terms, and the IDF do use human shields, namely Palestinians, to travel in front of them when moving into houses or about to attack. And human shield doesn't really refer to an entire population. And somehow since the last war on Lebanon, it's acquired a whole new meaning. The other thing that upsets me about the American media really is the lack of background in our journalists, in our television journalists, not our print journalists so much. But other media are also very problematic, including the Arab media. And the other thing that was interesting about this was the coverage of demonstrations around the world, in which I think many people felt as impotent as some people in the United States felt to change our policies on Iraq, that somehow they should have some input more than their voting power in the next election. And I know that was also felt by people in Israel who opposed the attack. So I don't know. I didn't think that was very well covered by the media other than violent demonstrators in London.
Well, I feel really difficulty to answer these questions because I was in Nicaragua for the last 2 weeks with almost no access to the internet, and I don't speak Spanish. So, but I tend to agree in general, at least, about the way media covers such conflicts without much background. I think another aspect to it is how the parties learned to manipulate the media and bring it to present certain aspects. One story, I don't want to be that partial, but one report that was this morning on the Haaretz online was that a doctor in Al-Shifa hospital in Gaza said that Hamas inflated the number, largely inflated the number of casualties, and there were actually only 500 to 600 dead, most of them Hamas. And this was in an interview to the Italian newspaper. I don't know if it's correct or not, but we know that parties are now sophisticated and media is one of the players in this game, so to speak.
I have nothing to add. So, yes, please raise your hand nice and high, and I will call on you. And remember, please, no long position statements, questions for the panel, please. We'll start over there.
Hello. I was just wondering if any of you think there's an innocent, excuse or reason why journalists were not allowed in at all by Israel to Gaza?
Not allowed into Gaza.
Or is that something that we should be really suspect of?
Not allowed into Gaza.
The question is, why were journalists not permitted to enter the Gaza Strip during the conflict? What is the reason for that? As far as anyone knows.
I believe the reason for that is exactly what we were just discussing, manipulation of the media. And there were actually a few stringers who work for different news services in Gaza. One who was attacked in the blogs is a Palestinian who works for the New York Times, who covered each thing that she covered from an extremely anti-Hamas perspective in a certain way. Of course, you do have camera phones, and you do have individuals in the community who know that they have to document the deaths of their family members and what's going on. So we almost have a kind of community journalism too that I'm not sure this blockage completely blocked out.
Yeah, I mean, the so-called citizen journalism has been quite remarkable in this conflict, I think. The video and the still photos taken with people's phones, the blogging that has gone on. But, I mean, as we just found out with this question of casualties, what is really hard to get is reliable information. There's a storm of information, and picking through it and actually working out what goes on, everyone has an agenda. Joe the plumber, of course, thinks no journalist should have gone in there at all. I don't know if any of you saw his attempts at being a war correspondent.
Missed it.
You should really, I encourage you to find this online. Joe the plumber was sent over as a war correspondent and was heard loudly opining to other correspondents that journalists shouldn't go anywhere near a war zone, that wars should be covered as they were in the First and Second World War, when newsreels played in the cinemas and everyone felt good about their troops. So that's one way to think about this. But seriously, the new media stuff, the blogs and all that has been something that, in a sense, we've had to rely on because some of the other sources we might have turned to were not allowed in during the conflict, or were allowed in under very controlled circumstances. It's frustrating. Itzchak, do you have any? Right.
Well, I can say Israel liked to imitate America in many things, and this was the strategy of Bush, even invasion of Iraq. So maybe. But seriously, I think everyone wants to manipulate the media, and everybody is afraid to be manipulated by the media. So I think everybody became careful about it.
I think some of the other questions, though, that will come out, for example, was white phosphorus, which is forbidden to use, used? We can see the photographs. There are things that we know. Some of us know who is in Hamas and who will be reappearing and who will not be reappearing. And I would dare to say that my estimates might be more accurate than that of the IDF. And the numbers of Hamas killed, let's say, for a fact, large civilian numbers of death that far exceed the numbers of Hamas that were killed. And I don't think there's a difficulty in saying that. The UN is going to investigate certain aspects of this. It says it will investigate them. And that's, but again, we'll see. Takes a little while.
Next question, please.
Granted, the name Omar Gaddafi doesn't immediately inspire confidence and trust, but still the New York Times today gave it enough credence to express his opinions on the Palestinian situation, and I thought it was a fairly balanced opinion, arguing the following. Partition or a two-state solution is not within reach. It should even be discarded, and we should start thinking of a one-state solution, for the simple reason that the name Israel only came into existence in 1948. Before that, Jews and Palestinians used the name Palestine. And perhaps a greater Palestine, one state, in which a modus vivendi and a modus operandi can be sought for the two civilizations to coexist, might be a better solution. What do you think of that?
I think the consciousness of everybody living there would have to be totally different than what it is. I mean, nationalism is real, and one is Arab nationalism and one is Zionism. You might as well ask the United States to mix it up with Mexico, since we both inhabit North America. I'm serious. I mean, nationalism is real, and the cultural differences are deep. So I think it's utterly preposterous.
You know, Ali Abu Nima, who runs the Electronic Intifada, it's a worthwhile site to look at. This is his position. And I very strongly disagree for the reason that Israel is established as a Jewish state. Over these 61 years, so much has happened. And so much that is ugly and wrong, and segregation. The populations don't know each other. They don't go to school together. They do work together, but more so in some areas than in others. I just don't think it's a solution, one-state solution, in which Palestinians can achieve justice. And that's what I think now. Perhaps everything will fall apart even more than it is now, and we'll stop speaking of a two-state solution. But for now, I think that is the best possible, and it isn't good. A good solution. It's just the best possible.
Well, I agree with most of my two distinguished colleagues say. I think one state is an unviable solution because it's really different, very different national movements, and now is enmity with so many years. I also agree about the two populations living completely segregated in Israel. It's something I really deplore. As a professor in Haifa University, half of my students are Arabs, half Jewish, and university is actually the first time they meet together, because they segregate all the way until that stage, and they remain segregated even when they are in the same institution. What I didn't have the time to say before in my talk, and now it's maybe the opportunity, is, as an Israeli, we also don't believe, most of us find it very difficult to believe in a two-state solution. It turns out maybe as bad as the one state. And, well, it's ironic that it was Ariel Sharon who pulled out of Gaza. And for us, on the left wing, we believe that this is the solution, the two states, two-state solution. But if what we see the situation since then made us really desperate about this too, and with confusion as no solution at all, because if we pulled out of Gaza and it became a base for shooting on Israel, if we pull out from the West Bank, and the same shooting it will be Tel Aviv, it will be all over, and it's something that's very difficult to risk it. Yes, so I would say, maybe it sounds to you pessimistic, but as one who lived all his life in Israel, in the Middle East, I feel there is no solution at all, just to manage somehow. That's what we can have.
How do you think, or throughout the talk you seem to make a distinction between the Gaza Strip.
Could you speak loud?
Really
I
loud.
cannot hear you.
Yeah.
Okay. Throughout the talk, you seem to be making a distinction between the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, politically especially. So then how do you think this conflict is going to change the relations between the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, and then also between Israel and the West Bank?
Wants to begin? Okay.
Uh,
I'll start if you want.
okay.
I don't know.
Good question.
Well, it's a good question. I think is Israel still rules over West Bank, or still there is occupation in the West Bank, if you wish. I think what Israel is trying to do there is to keep the Palestinian Authority as the supreme force, and I don't think this will change as long as Israel is there. But again, if Israel leaves the West Bank, I think it's only a question of time until Hamas will be the ruler in this part too. I hope it's at least partial answer.
If I can give a stab at it, Hamas is much stronger in the West Bank than Hamas admits. And I see my colleague nodding his head. So this is something that you might not really get through the media. You might have the impression that the population in the West Bank are well controlled by Fatah and the Fayyad government. Not only is it not well controlled, it's been sort of chaotic since June. There's been a crackdown on all charitable institutions, schools, endeavors that have businessmen, malls, anything that has anything connection with Hamas. Instead of Israel detaining people, it's been the PA detaining them until midnight. After midnight, it's Israel again. Lots of deplorable incidents. I went and visited a man in his late 60s who had been beaten into a coma by the PA, not by Israel. So there's a lot of fallout from fratricide in this period that this particular conflict is now in Gaza is going to worsen. Everyone will be jockeying for what will happen next. And I think the other thing is that you have this sort of problematic deal that Olmert offered at the last stage, which doesn't differ too much from previous ones, in which the major settlements in the West Bank would remain, and there would be withdrawal from another, what's left of the West Bank, other than the Jordan Valley, which, by the way, is the east side of the West Bank. Lots of agricultural developments, big Israeli encroachment. So Palestinians have said, not good enough. What we're left with is, depends on the figures, 13%, 28%, not good enough. And so I think, the West Bank is also in a very difficult situation, and you have differences between people who are living relatively well in some new areas and people who are still living in a pretty horrible state in the camps. So it isn't tenable. I don't agree that we can just sort of get along and manage. Maybe the Israelis can, but I think for some of the Palestinians, they can't. They can't just get along and manage. There is something that has to change, and that's why you've seen the resort to desperate measures.
Where are our microphones?
Is it on here? I'd like to ask a more narrow question, if I can, please. Dr. Zuhur, you've commented that, of course, the Israeli action was disproportionate here, and then a lot of discussion about Hamas. But it's true, isn't it, that international law recognizes that there may be non-combatant casualties. And an article in the New York Times the other day talked about it's really not a question of quantity, but the qualitative judgments made by the military. And as we've talked about the media too, I haven't seen much that disputes reports that Hamas fired rockets and fought from what would otherwise be protected places, from hospitals or schools, either within them or in close proximity, which might invite a response. So what I'm trying to see is what is your comments from any of you on the legal authority under international law for the IDF to respond if we accept the reports that Hamas fired from protected places, which would then lose that status. Is that clear enough?
That's clear enough. First
you.
of all, I forgot to issue my disclaimer that my views do not necessarily represent the Department of the Army or the Department of Defense, okay? My view is that there have been violations of international law which result in Gaza and the West Bank. Since 1967, the occupation itself is a violation of international law. It's a violation of 5 international laws. So now if we're going to get to the specific issues, it is illegal under international law to attack civilian police. On the first day of the aerial bombing, the police headquarters and the chief of police and an entire incoming class assembled were, blown to smithereens. And you have the question of why. Okay, the other, lead official who was killed, Hamas official, was the Minister of the Interior. So you leave the area with, no security. After this is all done, there are hardly any police left. As for the other violations and the issue that you're really getting to, which is what do you do when there is a legitimately elected government? Remember, they won the election, a legitimate election that the United States supposedly approved of, and then you say, but they're firing at the IDF. And then we have to go back to the, thorny question of who started it. So in order to get to a legal answer to your question, what Hanan Ashrawi said, and Hanan Ashrawi, remember, is not a Hamas member. She's an independent. She's about as moderate as you can get. In answer to this question, she said, you cannot separate Hamas from Palestinian society. It's not so easy to say it's just the guy with the rocket launcher. And as it's the relatives who voted for Hamas. It's the individuals in this neighborhood. So the IDF can say, okay, really, basically, it's everybody. On top of that, there are ridiculous allegations that were made, and I think these will come out. So, for example, blowing up the buildings in the Islamic University and the allegation that the science department of it's formerly the Al-Azhar University, but it's the Islamic University, that was being used in the science department in class to make bombs. Okay, that's ridiculous. So some of these things hopefully will be pursued, and actually, there are all kinds of legal issues that come up in Israel. In the next election, 2 Arab parties have been disqualified from running. That will go to court. And likely the Supreme Court in Israel will find in favor of the Arab parties. There have been all kinds of legal issues that have been decided in favor of the Palestinians by the justice system in Israel, but they haven't been upheld by the military. So I think international law is wonderful theoretically, but it's a problem for us. In terms of the operating conflict, the IDF has the upper hand. And, afterwards we can argue that it was illegal. I don't know what will happen because of it.
Well, as I said, I don't know all the details about that, but I can only recall the First Lebanon War, where I participated as a soldier. And when you are in war, you don't remember all the laws or the legal arrangements, and you fire from wherever you're fired. And I think if there were firing from the school or from other places, so soldiers will fire back, or some of the casualties of the Israeli sides were from soldiers, Israeli soldiers shooting on Israeli soldiers, because time of war you cannot make all these distinctions. It's afterwards to be sorted out what was legal and what was not.
Question from this side.
Hi. From my understanding, Islamists are often criticized for not really having any kind of real plan for governance and just saying that Islam will solve all of the world's problems. Do you think that Hamas's, relative success in upholding a government will provide an example for other Islamists, or do you think it's just a fluke?
Okay, well, I mean, as critical as we want to be about Islamists, and many people are, and I guess I'm less so, because I think, this view is here to stay. It's time for us to deal with reality. Being Islamist has not prevented the government in the Islamic Republic of Iran from governing. We may not like the way they govern, but they've governed. Hamas, despite every impediment you can think of, like no salaries and no anything to run on, and violence, which was very regrettable, in which it's very defensive about, with Fatah, managed to do things somewhat better than people thought it would do. For example, they established the first 911 service, which, deals with domestic violence and other stuff like that. They have been more disciplined than people thought they would be. And for academics like me and some others who study Islamic movements, that's kind of what you hope, is that if a group like Hamas or Hezbollah is part of the social system and cannot be eradicated, that if it becomes part of municipal councils and governments, it will behave responsibly and moderate its ideological content. Now, some of this is hard to explain, like there's misreporting. It was misreported that Hamas was about to enact Islamic penal law. It didn't. Has had discussion about it. Hamas was going to, shoot at any woman without a hijab. Well, I'm here to tell you, no. That didn't happen, won't happen. There are ways in which it has to be accountable, and yet it's sort of been prevented from being so because of the circumstances.
I was going to say that one of the positions that Hamas has had since coming to power in Gaza and confronting this international boycott and economic blockade is the need as the leadership in Gaza and as a political organization, not only to represent its constituency, but to protect them and to provide for their needs. And as it became clear that the economic embargo was not going to be significantly eased, they really felt like they were confronted with a situation where they either starve to death slowly or fight. And I don't say this to justify shooting rockets at civilian targets in Israel, just like I don't take rockets being fired into a country as justification for massive bombardment of the other. Frankly, I think both are really despicable actions, and I think both are disproportionate to the perceived aggression or the actual aggression in either case. But Hamas is a political movement. I think that there was an expectation among members of Hamas that having won an election, they would be real players in the international arena, and they were denied that. And I think if you've got an organization that is pushed into a corner, it's not going to just give up and say, well, we won the election, nobody likes us, we're going to give power back to Mahmoud Abbas, who lost the election. No, they're going to fight. And resistance is part of it. When they don't get the basic needs of their people met. What do you think their people expect them to do when they can't get medical supplies and food and fuel? Of course they're going to resist. And of course an Israeli government is going to see this as intolerable provocation, and they're going to attack. And this is why external intervention is needed in the end. And frankly, I think the question of international law and legal violations and disproportionate force are great for argument and blaming each other, all right? And they feed the nationalist sense of grievance. But I don't think that they offer a way out of the impasse of a cycle of violence.
Well, I can add that. Well, I agree that Hamas really works against all odds in the most difficult situations of blockade. But as I say, Hamas had two faces. One was the old Muslim Brothers organization, is a huge network of welfare, and I think they're still doing well with this. They are popular among the population. There is the other face of it, that the goal, the supreme goal, in my view, and I think in this we disagree, is to exterminate Israel. So the question, I think, David, is again, what comes first? Yes, what is more important? Who started? Is it the Israeli government to blockade it, or Hamas who started to shoot? And this is something you cannot really answer or solve. But I think they did quite well. They are still the most popular force in Gaza. I think also in West Bank. And I agree, they are a power to stay.
Down here.
I'm afraid I'm kind of uneducated on the subject, so this might come across as a stupid question, but where is Hamas getting the rockets from? Are they homemade? Are they imported? I'm just curious about their origin.
Well, Hamas has its own made rockets, the Qassams, named after one hero from the 30s, Izzedin al-Qassam, worked in my hometown, Haifa, but is a symbol, a national symbol and religious symbol. And this is, as you said, dump rockets. That's right. But since Israel left the Philadelphia axis, the border between Gaza and Egypt, there was a huge amount of weapons smuggled through this line, mostly underground. And as far as I read, most of it comes from Iran as part of its strategy to get a foothold. They have Hezbollah, they want to have Hamas, and they want to make a group of organizations, maybe with Syria, yes, that will be the revolutionary, the resistance, the Islamist axis in the Middle East.
Here I disagree, and it has to do with the Iranian source of the weaponry, and this is a claim in Israel. I think that there's a lot that you don't see or read here. I mean, there's been just this fever about Iran for a couple of years in Israel. It's not the first time. It's come about before. The relationship between Hamas and Iran is much, much less than the relationship between Hezbollah and Iran. And the relationship between Hamas and Iran really, I believe, is not money. There's a dispute about the weapons, but it's really one of cause. When Arafat concluded Oslo, Iran was very angry with the abandonment of that principle. And so at that point, there was sort of an opening for Hamas. And there's some other regional factors. For example, the Jordanian government's concern over Hamas and its visits to, we're talking about visits, and we're talking about rhetoric, we're talking about rhetorical support, I believe, more than anything else. Some other people say that some of the rockets are Chinese-made. There are other arguments that in this interim there have been more and more stockpiling of Strela 7, that's shoulder-launched missiles. But you're not really talking about anything like the mighty IDF has. And in terms of Israel's broader strategy, I mean, this is really interesting because it's Egypt that has the largest and most dangerous army to Israel, and it's bound by an agreement. Now, Jordan is also bound now. Syria is kind of unable to do anything because of the pressure that the United States has been putting on Syria since 2003. Lebanon, you have a little tiny army, and you do have Hezbollah, and you do have rockets, but you have a kind of a status quo since the last war. So who's the remaining enemy? It's Hamas, and the rockets are really, I think, just an excuse. I mean, this is one tactic. The previous tactic that really concerned Israel were the suicide attacks, and those were basically negotiated away. They were. They could return.
I think we have time for about 2 more questions. Does that sound good? So I'll take one from here in the middle.
What do you think the likelihood is that the U.S. would consider recognizing Hamas? And if they did, do you think that would be a good thing or a bad thing?
What was the second part?
If they did recognize Hamas, would it help or would it make things worse?
David.
I think this is one of the first. I think my hunch is the Obama administration is going to wait until the Israeli elections to make some bold decisions. That's my hunch. Unless they think that by making some bold decisions they can influence the Israeli elections, which is probably a mistake. Anyway, one view in the U.S. and in the Arab world holds that the way forward is to form a unity Palestinian government of Hamas and Fatah. All right, to somehow heal the breach between Hamas and Fatah, which may not be possible. To do this, and to bring through Fatah, Hamas into peace talks, by virtue of which the U.S. would have to deal somehow with Hamas. Now, this is not unprecedented. The U.S. would not deal with the PLO until 1988. All right, I mean, there's this long, to my mind, very unfortunate history of not recognizing the other in conflicts by both sides. And I think this is part of it. Now, this might happen. Others feel that Fatah shouldn't do this. They shouldn't trust Hamas, that Hamas, any dealings they have with Fatah is merely to further weaken Fatah. But anyway, this is a debate going on within American foreign policy and Arab policy circles. But that's the only, to my mind, likely avenue for the U.S. to recognize Hamas, is if it forms a unity agreement with Fatah. All right. Would it help or hurt? Who knows? Who knows? It's like a lot of things in diplomacy, you don't know until you try. All right. So that's my take on it.
My answer is a legislative council who are not formally members of Hamas, but who represent Hamas. You can talk to them. One of them is on the cover of this book, Nasruddin al-Sha'ir, who Jimmy Carter talked to. Okay, he's not formally Hamas. However, he's a moderate, so you could talk. I mean, there are different ways this could be approached. And I think the answer is, if you're going to have diplomacy, you have to communicate. And we need diplomacy now.
It's kind of like the situation in Madrid when the Shamir government would not talk to the PLO, but they talked to Palestinians that the PLO chose to represent the PLO. But they were not members of the PLO.
No, I agree. There must not be an official recognition, but I leave it to the Americans.
All right. One more question from over here. There was a hand I saw. No? All right. Shalom. Make it a good one.
If George Mitchell and Dennis Ross are appointed by the new administration to serve as special envoys, I'd love to hear your thoughts about would that be effective, or would that be the right next step for the Obama administration?
Well, I'm kind of constrained because David is very friendly with Dennis Ross, or related to him, or something. I mean, so I have to
David
constrain
is
my
Dennis
remarks
Ross.
here because
That's
it's a misperception.
Yeah, it is a
Sorry.
misperception.
Okay, all right. My view is that I disagree with many things that Dennis Ross has said and did, most notably in conjunction with Matthew Levitt on the pursuit of terrorists and mosques in the United States and everything else. So I don't know how new we're getting there. With the other representative who has been named, as I understand, as special envoy, you have the background of settling the conflict in Ireland, which is very important. And I think the precedent maybe is not so much who, but how much will there is. Is there a will to sit for 2 years like they did and, just kind of put the shutters down on, whether this person is associated with so-called terrorist group or not? If there's that will, then it's a very important step. If it's just symbolic, then I don't think much of it.
Well, I don't know enough about this person, so maybe I say something a bit different. I think both the United States and Israel, both government and people, should know more about Islam, more understanding about what is Islam, distinguish better between the religion, between moderates, even between fundamentalists that are moderate and work for these societies, which is the great majority of Muslims, and radical groups. And we can just hope that this moderate camp will win, because when this comes, so there is maybe some way for solution, also for Palestine-Israel question.
I would endorse exactly what Sherifa said. It depends on the will in the White House. I do think with George Mitchell and his experience negotiating in Ireland, and Dennis Ross, he used to play basketball with him, as always not related to me.
I'm sorry. I thought he was your cousin.
He's not my cousin. Like you, I disagree with him about many things, but he's extremely familiar with a lot of the details. He might be helpful to George Mitchell and Secretary Clinton and President Obama. So I do think it's a good team. I mean, there are a lot of really excellent people with lots of experience from the American side on dealing with these issues, and I think President Obama is going to draw on more than these two. They're just going to be the two in the headlines.
Okay. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you very much.
And just please thank me, or please join.
Thank you.
Please join me in thanking our panelists and moderator.
Maybe you will make another announcement if you really want to hand those out.
Oh, yes.
concludes tonight's
Listen, you can come and get these until they run out.